All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plaid and coffee, and this is David. Welcome to PacWest Bigfoot. Recently, I've been going through some of the older stories now that I'm not so nervous doing this so much. But I've been redoing some of the old based on true Bigfoot encounter stories where I take your encounters and your reports and turn them into really awesome campfire-like stories for you. And nowadays I don't have to clear my throat as much, although I do from time to time, but I don't have to as much. I'm a little less nervous. But I will do this real quick. We're going to get a nice little sip of the old coffee there. And we're going to get into this week's, this is an update of the Lemolo Lake Bigfoot. Campers get Bigfoot visit twice. And actually, I have to tell you, this is a really cool one because this actually happened near me. As a matter of fact, me and my boys go up around this area for camping ourselves. So, without further ado, let's get on with this week's updated version. I love to camp, and so does my wife. We are not much for hunting, but fishing, camping, and even hiking up around Lemolo Lake, Oregon is something we love to do. At least when Bigfoot is not around, that is. We had our first ever, and only to this point, encounter and experience with Bigfoot up around Lemolo Lake, Oregon, back in the late 1980s. I figured it was about time we at least shared our story out there and let people know that yes, Bigfoot does in fact roam the area. So here's the wife's and mine account. And yes, my wife saw it through the screen of the tent, and to this day she gets a little creeped out camping still. 100 times at Lemolo Lake. It was probably the 100th time we had camped at Lemolo Lake when a Bigfoot entered our campsite. That was not quite a campsite. Twice. No kidding, this thing came back for a second raid, if you will. My wife and I, and let me set this up for you. Well, we love to camp and fish. We were both born and raised Oregonians from Portland, eventually settled in the southern Oregon area, where things were a little less, well, to be honest, weird. We are the conservative mindset, mostly, but not on everything. Southern Oregon became our home in the mid-1980s when we got married and bought a home between Glide and Roseburg, Oregon. Both of us worked in nearby and albeit larger town or city of Roseburg. It is a little bit of a drive back and forth daily, but it is not so bad as some have it, as we were not literally in Glide, we were just outside of it a bit, towards Roseburg. Some of our favorite hikes were nearby as well, like Susan Creek and Fall Creek, and sometimes when we felt like the ride, we would head up to the Twin Lakes area. For fishing, there was plenty of reservoirs, and of course Lemolo Lake and Rattlesnake Mountain for more hiking and whatnot. Fishing and camping, well, Diamond and Lemolo were our favorites. That late spring would be Lemolo. And no, it was and is not the last time either. While the experience was rather frightening, we did not feel as though it wanted to hurt us or was really interested in us per se. It wanted something else. So here's what happened. Camping in La La Land. Pool Creek is where we decided to camp at, and to tell you the truth, we were just past the edges of that near the lake itself, a small inlet actually. And yes, the mosquitoes were horrid that year. They're bad there, but that was just crazy, I remember. It felt as though we had the whole lake to ourselves, however. The nearest neighbor was almost 75 to 100 yards away at least. Not to mention, we moved our campsite another 20 yards away from the actual site itself and made our own camp back in the woods next to an inlet along the lake. Yet that was against the rules, I'm sure, but there was nobody around, and nobody came to enforce the rules anyways. The fishing was good, except catching those lame little chubs that were introduced a few years before that had almost taken over the lake completely. Hopefully one day they can get rid of them. To help out, we catch them, then literally toss them into the bushes. These fish are really like a disease, so let the bleeding heart stuff go. These are not natural fish to this lake. But as I said, fishing was good though. We were actually getting a few trout for dinner that second night. We were tent campers. Well, today we are teardrop campers now, but back then it was nothing but a tent and in the roughing it part. The first night was nice and uneventful, but the second night, well, those events would change our attitude towards what is out here in these woods, for sure. Dinner, a game, and Bigfoot. The second day was great. A few drops of rain here and there, but we were expecting that. The rest of the week was supposed to be perfect for this time of the year. After some fishing in the canoe around the inlet, we decided to fish from the bank while listening to a baseball game on the radio. Yes, the reception was just fine up there. Actually, it was better than back home, to tell you the truth. We pulled up the canoe, tied it to a tree, got our poles back in the water, and decided to clean up camp while we cooked up some fish and boxed macaroni and cheese for dinner. My wife decided to go and check on the fishing poles just in case. I decided to flip the fish wrapped in foil over and grab my book, kick back, and listen to the Mariners play the visiting Red Sox. That 4-game series was awesome, by the way. After a few moments, my wife called my name and had me look across the inlet to the other side. I had no idea what she was looking at. Well, at first I didn't. After a moment, I noticed a person walking through the forest. A tall person at that. It was too dark at the time of that day, I remember, to make out anything except they were walking. And they were rather tall. At least it looked that way. My wife was worried it was someone with a resort and we were possibly going to get a tongue lashing about being out so far from our own paid-for campsite. But the figure disappeared over the small hill and off to another part of the lake, we thought. We were out of the proverbial woods, we supposed, and left it at that. I got back to my game and dinner, and my wife was fishing and listening in on the game as well. Dinner was great, game was still going on, and the Mariners were up by 2 when it got dark. We put some larger logs on the fire, and the stars were out as the clouds disappeared. It would be a cooler night, but in the end, I probably would have taken absolutely cold over absolutely unbelievable. My wife decided to rinse the dishes off in the lake and for some unknown reason looked across the inlet and over to that hillside. She returned with a rather confused look about her. She said she saw that person again walking, this time closer to the shore. And they actually stopped for nearly a minute, and it seemed to be, as far as she could tell, staring at us or her. Then they walked off again, but this time south into the woods, not over the hill. She was not frightened by any means, but she was wondering why they would be walking around near dark over there. There was no camping sites over there at all. Eventually, after a few minutes or so, and the Red Sox knocking in another run, making her a little frazzled, we forgot about the passerby. Footsteps in our camp. It was getting late and the game was over. We decided to not continue being dessert for the mosquitoes and headed off to bed. I am a heavy sleeper. My wife is a light sleeper. Pretty normal couple, I believe. Either way, it was my wife who ended up practically giving me a Charlie horse, waking me up, and with her hand covering my mouth. I was trying to mumble and speak, but she leaned in and held her finger over her lips, telling me to shush. It was then that I heard what sounded like footsteps, literally bipedal footsteps, walking along the shoreline of the lake. Of course, that is not illegal, but whoever it was had to know we were there, and that was, well, rude. But my wife had a more peculiar look on her face, I could tell. She leaned over again and whispered in my ear and said that seconds before she woke me, she noticed the shadow of this person was pretty tall. Taller than anyone she had ever seen before. Huge, in fact. Okay. Our minds, my mind, did flash for a minute to Bigfoot. I am a Pacific Northwesterner, for crying out loud. We laid there listening as whatever, or whoever it was, walked along, skirting the shoreline of the lake here and there, and soon stepped into the water itself. At one point it seemed to have stopped. I could finally see the shadow of this thing as my own eyes adjusted to the bright moonlit night and the shadow this thing was casting. They were huge. My best guess would be at least 7 to 8 feet tall. They squatted down and seemed to be moving its arms, and with the sound of water swishing around, I believe it had its hands in the water. We also noticed that it would glance over its shoulder. Well, its upper torso and head would turn back towards our camp and just stare, I suppose. They did this for about a minute or so until it stood and continued walking down the shoreline out of sight and out of hearing distance too. Was it a person? A Bigfoot? We looked at each other for a moment until I think I gathered enough nerve to get out of the tent. The campfire was almost all but out at that point, so I grabbed some kindling and got the fire started back up. I do have to say it was eerily quiet. Even the crickets that did chirp earlier were not as loud as they were before. Whoever and whatever it was, I thought, was most likely still nearby. But at the time, while my wife and I were a little on edge, we gave it up to them being in person. A passerby in the night who may have realized they were near a camp and moved on down the shoreline. An hour later, the fire was roaring and we were tired again. We headed off to sleep once the crickets were chirping loudly and the fire was popping. Really? Bigfoot in our camp again? It was late, really late, around 3 a.m., if I recall correctly, but we were woken again by rustling around the camp this time. My wife, of course, heard it. Yeah, it was Bigfoot, and it walked into our camp. Her eyes were as big as golf balls, seriously. And when I woke up and looked at her, I could see the whites of her eyes in the low firelight that bounced all around the tent. I also looked over to notice that tall figure in our camp. It was gigantic. Its shoulders were at least twice the size of mine, or even more. I did get a chance to gauge it again against the tree by our tent, and the thing was just shy of 8 feet tall. Harry, you could see in the backlight that this thing was covered in hair, not fur, but hair. From the top of the funny-shaped head to the buttocks down to his feet, it was just covered in hair. You could see it flowing in the shadow. I did not know until a few minutes later, but my wife and that thing looked at each other, face to face, with only the tent to separate them. She said it came from behind the tent itself, from the direction of a trail that wrapped around the inlet. She then said the footsteps were very heavy and approached the tent slowly. That is how I was woken up at the time. It smacked the tent, and my wife let out a little squeal, if you will. She said it bent over and looked at the tent, and it just so happened she was looking through the screen at the tent at the time, a little window on the side. She said it smelled really bad, like rotten onions and skunk. She did not get a real good look at the face because it was still too dark on that side of the tent, but she knew it was a Bigfoot and not human. What she could tell, however, was that it was hairy, and while she could not tell much because of the lack of light, she could also tell that its skin was lighter than its hair color, and that its face was long too. It had a raspy inhale, an exhale as it breathed, and it put its large hand on the tent and pulled it away quickly, letting it kind of slap the tent. That is when I woke up, and it had already taken 2 massive steps in between the campfire and our tent. It seemed to sway from left to right as it stood there facing the tent. I was wondering if this thing was going to attack us or what. But after a few seconds or so, it walked over to the table, where it knocked over our ice chest and took the fish in it. We would find that out in the morning. It was not completely proportioned like a human, but close enough to know that we were dealing with a Bigfoot. Tall, hairy, smelly, and you could just tell it was what it was. Not to mention my wife said it was, and that was all I needed to know. It finally stopped rummaging through the ice chest and other stuff on the table. It eventually walked back down towards the shoreline, and from there it started walking off into the woods where we believe it came from earlier that night. The footsteps were heavy, I remember, and the next morning we made out some pretty significant impressions. However, because of the lack of a lot of decent rainfall at that point, it was rather dry, and impressions were all we could see. My wife that morning was somewhat frightened. Not too frightened as in scared out of her mind, but more like a nervous frightened. Lemolo Lake Bigfoot. We did not get out of the tent until daylight started creeping up, and that was not too much longer actually after it was gone, or at least we could not sense it was around any longer. And no, we did not pack up and leave either. We just moved back to our regular camping spot where we were surrounded by people. No, not Bigfoot. Like I said, after a bit we did not feel as it was interested in us, just the food we had. Its long arms and huge hands did not make too big of a mess of everything as we thought either. Only the ice chest was knocked over and empty of the fish, while most of the contents on the table were left alone. Just a can of beans on the ground and the chest itself were there. Personally, it was quite the experience to see such a huge creature out there, especially after thinking to ourselves that we probably, most likely, have been around them before and did not know it. They exist after all. However, I do have to say this. While I am hoping for another encounter like that one, I know my wife is not. That is our encounter story. Thanks, Jeff and Reba.